with Vipassana, so this is right, the Theravada tradition, right, as opposed to, I guess you could call, depending on different ways of cataloging, Tibetan would be Vajrayana or Mahayana. And
Yeah.
this is coming out of Burma or Myanmar, as it's now called, right? And is
Yeah,
it right to say
yeah.
that it's grounded in the Satipatthana Sutta, and that mindfulness is a very central part of this?
Yeah, very much. It is the practice of Satipatthana, and so that's the discourse the Buddha gave on the four foundations of mindfulness. You know, and even though it's a relatively short discourse, you know, maybe 8 or 9 pages long. It's not that long, but it contains within it a wide variety of ways of practicing it. And Munindra had told me that in Burma itself, there are over 50 different techniques of Vipassana. So it's not just one method within that understanding. There are many approaches to it. Yeah.
Right, and I think you also, I mean, you've trained with lots of great masters, including Goenka, who I know the method. Am I right that the kind of method that you teach comes from a slightly different lineage of Vipassana, because there's Goenka very much emphasized body scan, right?
Yeah. So the lineage that I'm now teaching out of, so to speak, is from Burma and Mahasi Sayadaw, who was one of the great, meditation masters in Burma. But my own predilection in spiritual practice, and you may be familiar, some years ago I wrote this book, One Dharma, because my mind likes to see what unifies different traditions rather than create these strong boundaries between them. And so even though the main thrust of the teaching comes out of this tradition of Mahasi Sayadaw, really interweave a lot of different approaches. And as you mentioned, I did study with Goenka for about 4 years. And he does emphasize the body scanning. In the Mahasi system, it's more beginning with the breath and then a more choiceless awareness. But they're not in conflict in any way. And so even now, sometimes I'll just be sitting and, spend some time scanning the body and then open up. So even though some people think that there's huge differences, there are, some difference in methodology, but they're not critical differences. They're just different ways of developing mindfulness.
Right. And so you mentioned your book, One Dharma, which is a wonderful book I recommend. And it kind of starts with a crisis, right? I guess that you saw these different kind of metaphysical systems. But do you think it's kind of a strength of Western Buddhism that it has the opportunity to integrate lots of different traditions? Do you see that as a positive?
I do, with a caution. So first, it's kind of a new thing that a lot of these Buddhist traditions from Asia are actually meeting and interacting with one another, because in Asia, they certainly haven't. Having practiced in Asia, the Burmese don't know anything about Tibetan Buddhism, and vice versa, or Zen, or but in the West, these traditions are meeting, often for the first time in centuries. And there's a cross-fertilization which is taking place. And these teachings now, especially with, the internet, they're so widely available. So there's so much accessible, for people. So generally what I suggest to people, in the beginning is to shop around a little bit, just to, to taste a few different ways and practices and lineages and traditions, to see what really resonates, what inspires us to actually do the practice rather than just read about it. And then to devote some time to that practice, in the beginning, not to be jumping around from one practice to another, because then we really won't get any depth, of understanding. But after some time, after having devoted ourselves for some time and we feel confident in our understanding, of the practice, of the lineage, of the teachings, of our own minds, really, then I think it can be very helpful, just if one is interested, and not necessary, but if one were interested, to explore other practices. So just as an example, after many years of my immersing myself in the Vipassana practice, some friends of mine who had been very involved in Tibetan Buddhism, in Dzogchen practice, they took myself and some friends to meet some of their great teachers in Nepal. And so I began to study a little bit in the Dzogchen lineages. And I just found it very complementary. It really learned a lot from that. And I didn't have any problem kind of synthesizing the two. So I think it is possible to really learn from different perspectives and different traditions at that point where we feel well grounded in one. And so I think that could be an approach.
Yeah. And what was the thing that you found unified all of these different traditions? Was it non-clinging?
Yeah. So you mentioned just a bit earlier kind of the big struggle I went through as I first began the Dzogchen teachings, because the metaphysics are really quite different, from the Burmese and the Dzogchen Tibetan side. And so for a long time, I was just struggling with the question, who's right? Are the Burmese right? Are the Tibetans right? And I was driving myself crazy until I realized I was asking the wrong question. It's not a question of who's right, but really seeing all teachings as skillful means rather than as statements of ultimate truth. So I came up with this phrase, metaphysics as skillful means. And so then skillful means for what? Skillful means ultimately for non-clinging. But we could say skillful means for reducing suffering, for weakening greed and hatred and ignorance, for engendering kindness and compassion. So if a particular practice does that, it doesn't matter what the metaphysics are, so we can learn from it all, even contradictory teachings, if it's all leading to non-clinging. And the Buddha was quite clear that this is the essence of the liberated mind. Very often in the text, he would say liberation through non-clinging. So if a particular practice is leading to that, regardless of the philosophy, or the metaphysical underpinnings, then it's helpful. It's leading us, towards that kind of awakening.
I think this fits really nicely as well with the teachings themselves, because if you understand metaphysics to be it's a story you're telling about the world, and with these practices you see how limited concepts are, and that the world can't be encapsulated by concepts, right? So I think it doesn't have to be a crisis, I guess.
Yeah, exactly. But I had to learn that.